This is Left Hand, and I am your host, Sereptie, aka Craig of the Acid Horizon podcast. And today's release is going to be a novel one because what you're about to listen to is a live stream that I conducted with friend and co-host Adam C. Jones of the Acid Horizon podcast. And the truth of the matter is that I will be away from my desk for about a week or so, enjoying a well-deserved rest of sorts. And I wanted to get something out on the podcast feed before I took my little break. And what we decided to do was Adam and we have a project with Acid Horizon and with artist and creator Noah Trapolino, also known as Penkeeper. And perhaps you already know about this. It is the Acéphalous project. Acéphalous, the Erotic Tarot of Georges Bataille, and a companion book of art and essays. And in this live stream, we talk about that a little bit. So there's a bit of an infomercial vibe, I will warn you, just because we're trying to get support for the Kickstarter program that starts on October 31st. But there is a substantive element to this particular live stream, which is our discussion of Adam's essay in the proposed book. It's an essay on Bataille called On War, tentatively, and we are going to talk about Bataille's relationship to the notion of war and how it changed over time, over his corpus, and in relation to his actual experience dealing with the horrors of war. While I am away on my little break, I will be doing something that isn't very much like breaking at all, which is an interview which will either debut on this channel or on Acid Horizon, or there will be segments on both. And I very much look forward to getting that to you, even though I'd like to keep it a secret for now. In any event, let's listen to what Adam C. Jones has to say on Bataille and war, and we will see you again soon. Well, I hadn't finished it the first time, but I did. I just finished it 2 days ago, Oksana Timofeeva's Solar Politics, which I realized that if I ever end up teaching in a university setting again, and even if I do an intro to philosophy class if I just had my druthers about teaching philosophy, that's just an excellent introduction book overall, because not only does it, basically the arc is Bataille, but it also gives a very nice introduction to Benjamin, a little bit of Schmidt, like the whole distinction between mythic and divine violence. And of course, then how that maps on or corresponds with, sacred violence in Bataille. And also it contextualizes it with respect to uprisings that occurred in 2018 in Russia. So there's a little bit of a political piece there too, and it's just eminently readable. And if you ever wanted to introduce French philosophy to somebody absolutely against the idea of engaging with philosophy, let alone French philosophy, I think this is a way to warm them up to. So it's a very good book in that respect. But
I definitely recommend Oksana Timofeeva's Solar Politics. Also, it's a great critique of Land's reading of Bataille. There are some facts about Bataille that Land does get correct. One of them we'll talk about later in relation to war, although he still often trades on the aesthetic of Bataille as this thinker of full-throated embracing the destruction, which I guess all accelerationism has. A lot of it is conditioned on the reading of the early Bataille, which sort of says that, I remember once at an event on accelerationism, thinking some of the urbanomic folks, I think Amy said something along the lines, I think the ecology is incompatible with time itself, because she holds that time in a very accelerationist way is structured towards loss in that kind of grand entropic Bataillean kind of way. I think it's an interesting use of Bataille. I don't think that's where Bataille ultimately ends up. We're going to talk about something I in the reading which we did for a couple of years, I used to keep talking about Bataille as a peacenik.
right.
Like Bataille turned into this sort of Kantian, wanting to find perpetual peace, or as he calls it, dynamic peace, because he's just so terrified of what he sees in World War II. We get that. That's what Guilty is. It's just his war diaries.
Right. And I love the intermittent reflections on his reading of Hegel in the diary too, which is great. But we have 13 people in. And so what's going on here at Acid Horizon /Left Hand? So Adam and I decided to pop on the live stream today for a couple of reasons. One was I am going on a trip for a few days, more than a few days abroad, Whereupon I will actually do a little bit of filming for something for either the Acid Horizon channel or the Left Hand channel or both channels. And it will remain a surprise to our viewers, but that's coming soon. It should be exciting. But also, and more importantly, Adam and I want to talk about Acéphalous, this project that we're working on with Pen Keeper, aka Noah Trapolino. And this is something that we've had in the cooker for a long, long time. Once I finished my tarot deck, I was talking with Noah, who was at the time a very close supporter of the podcast and active member of our reading groups. And we were all just very impressed with his drawings, and particularly the drawings that he did of us during one of the reading groups. That was really, I mean, really, if you want, to stand out to somebody in the world, draw a picture of them, I guess. But I noticed that there was definitely a quality to these drawings because I had tarot on the mind. I was like, you know what, given all of the tarot decks and stuff that I've been looking at, you should consider organizing some of your own drawings into a kind of tarot series or an oracle of some kind. And he said, all right, let's do it. Let's put this together. But of course, we put a few things together. We put it in front of a few people and they weren't as receptive initially. And so what we decided to do is start our own project. And we had the great benefit of meeting with a friend and fan of the podcast, Meredith, who has been immersed in this world of crowdfunding and has been able to help us a little bit and is trying to get this project going for us. And I've already spoken a lot about it. Maybe, Adam, you can fill in the more important details about what we're doing.
Well, yeah, the Bataille Tarot mostly comes from the fact that Noah is just a fantastic erotic artist. I mean, this is why he did the artwork for Anti-Oculus, the stuff in the inside, of course, and the cover artwork for my next book, The New Flesh, and just the way he sort of maps the contours of a body and all of the explosive, convulsive, and let's say sort of liquid elements of it really has a strong resonance with Bataille. And so we got together. He was already doing similar pieces, and then we spoke about doing it as a Bataille tarot deck. I think all of the major arcana are currently done. You can actually go and see them on his website. And we might see if we can crowdfund essentially a Bataille tarot deck as another educational matter, because it's going to be a deck and then also a book as well. I mean, the deck's going to come with a standard little booklet that explains the meaning of a lot of the cards. And but tarot decks that use philosophy are essentially sets of flashcards that have a sort of a set of role of allowing you to play with concepts whilst teaching you them, and also making imaginative and sort of psychological sort of self-examinations. They're kind of like intuition pumps in philosophy. But we're not saying that this thing's going to tell you the future, but rather this can tell you something about the concepts you're using to think about your own future, and indeed other aspects of your own temporality. I mean, the book's going to be interesting because it's going to be a bit more critical, I guess, because a lot of the deck is meant to be somewhat of an auto-critique of Bataille, sort of stretching his concepts to its limits. I mean, because we was doing the Bataille reading groups, possibly for 3 years.
Yeah.
And, it became sort of a way in which we kept confronting various limits in Bataille's thought. So, for example, the absence of any kind of theory of masochism. Masochism does show up in Bataille, not in eroticism, in the book My Mother, but always kind of disparagingly. There's no kind of economy of masochism. And we spoke about this a while ago with our friend Tiger Lou, who was doing this kind of project of replacing the Sard with Masoch in Bataille's sort of wider cosmic project of thinking about the energetics of the universe and how that relates to the economy here on Earth. And we also wanted to do some other things in terms of, for example, I mean, Bataille is a very masculinist thinker. I think Patrick French shows this quite well. Women are always reduced to a status of objectivity, or being the object for Bataille. And this includes, this makes his readings of stuff like the Venus of Willendorf, like this famous sort of statue for prehistoric art. He always reads it as being something that men make rather than anyone else being involved. It really does occlude a lot of the more interesting potentials of his work. I mean, also, what else is there really? I mean, there's stuff, for example, I mean, we never really got to follow up with Ariadne about her work, Black Bataille, linking Bataille's theory of base materialism to not only to the art world, but to the theories of Afro-pessimists like Frank B. Wilderson III. And we wanted to spend some time in the literary form and as well in aesthetic forms, trying to find the limits of the images of Bataille's concepts, and in a way provide new images to try and expand them, or at least bring them to their limit, because Bataille is the thinker that brings things to their limits. So therefore, the greatest tribute to Bataille would be to bring the man's concepts to his own limits themselves, which isn't necessarily always easy, but isn't necessarily always hard either. I mean, you guys would share the historical data for that, the reliance on these sort of French Orientalist texts or imperial diaries. You can see the biases just creep into that, where he's looking for data ultimately to confirm theses he's already sort of laid out in general.
Yeah, I think that's just one of the challenges of that era of thinking too, is the lingering influence of anthropology. I say lingering, actually, it was quite ascendant at that time as well. And I think what Adam and I, in conjunction with Noah, wanted to do was, this is just to recap in another way, what Adam's saying is, given what I had learned about the tarot deck, and given that the 22 major arcana trump series, for example, there's a way in which you could import any number of philosophical concepts to create a set of correspondences. But I think there's something about Bataille's body of concepts in particular that, and we really almost had no problem finding a way to, for example, find a place for the concept of the impossible, the concept of glory, the concept of headlessness, and other particular figures in Bataille's general oeuvre that we thought would round out the major arcana. And with that said, I think, whatever you believe about the tarot or the tarot deck, the one thing it has occasioned is this ability to create a kind of pedagogy that you can kind of map into this sort of fun game, or this activity of introspection or sharing with others. And we thought, well, this is an interesting way to do philosophy as well. And the reports that I've gotten, from people on Instagram or, just DMing us on various social media platforms about the Philosopher's Tarot was precisely that. It gave them a way to engage with philosophy in a very kind of playful way. And we wanted to replicate that. But at the same time, this time we wanted to bring a more rigorous rendering of particular philosophical concepts in the form of a book. And if you navigate to our Instagram page, for example, and I think I even put it on Twitter as well, over the past few days, you can see where we had put, images of the perspective book. I did a little mock-up, and, there's a kind of vision here. We wanted to make it a 12 by 12 coffee table book that would feature all of the art that we're going to do. But we're also going to include essays by Adam. I will partake in some of the writing. Noah's going to do some of the writing as well. And if I'm not mistaken, one of the things that we're going to try to do as goals for this particular campaign is bring in perhaps somebody like Stuart Kendall or other notable Bataille scholars who might be contributors to the project. And not just Bataille scholars, but also other people in the world of erotica who might offer something to this project in some sense. And maybe, Adam, you can say a little bit more about that, because you've been dealing with that too.
Well, yeah, because the aesthetic dimension of Bataille. But Bataille is a thinker whose works. Yeah, I mean, the person in the chat just got it. Yeah, I think it is. We are talking to the person you've mentioned, Hobok, in the chat. I don't know if we can announce it yet, because I don't think nothing's been fully set in stone. But there are talks going on. But I mean, Bataille's work rarely translates into other visual mediums or media. Sorry. I mean, there are some examples. There's the early 2000s adaptation of Ma Mère, which I think got kind of lampooned a little bit in the critics' press. I've not seen it. It's not really my sort of thing, to be honest. Mm. And then you had there was one attempt at an adaptation of Story of the Eye, and someone recently bought the rights to Story of the Eye to make it a film, but I don't think there's any project going forward with that, because it's his favorite movie or something. But I don't think he's quite aligned with the sort of stuff we're doing on Bataille. I mean, in terms of the erotica aspects, I mean, the stuff we're going to theorize is ultimately going to be, Noah's probably going to do the essay on masochism, sort of finding the limits of eroticism. I mean, so far the stuff I've been writing, I mean, I've got plans at least to write an essay on war, which we're going to discuss today, on how World War II changed Bataille's thinking. And it challenges some of the received images. If we think of Bataille as this full-on warlike, loss for loss's sake, blood for the blood god kind of figure. I've written one of the essays is already out on my blog. It's an introduction to Bataille's method of non-knowledge, sort of drawing on Hegel in particular. And then there's going to be at least one more essay, which is going to be an essay on Bataille's concept of reproduction. So Bataille has a concept of reproduction, but it's kind of interesting. It has concepts of people reproduce each other, reproduction, and its links to death, how there is a continuity of life through birth and death. But what's interesting is how limited it is, because he doesn't have a theory of social reproduction. I mean, he does give a theory of reproduction in eroticism and in the accursed share. But what's interesting and kind of embarrassing is Bataille mentions pregnancy once in the entirety of the accursed share, and it's in relation to cows. We are going to give something of a feminist import to the critique of Bataille here, because goddamn does his work need it. But it's going to be a loving critique to that extent. It's going to be a somewhat indulgent one as well, which that's part of the fun of it. Why do a book on Bataille? Because we agree with Michel Foucault when he said that he's one of the most important writers of the 20th century. And of course, in Literature and Evil, he does also mention reproduction in the same term as death. Literature and Evil actually is going to be quite a central book to at least my reading of it, because it's one of the few books in which Bataille really compresses a lot of his concepts into sort of bite-sized chunks. I mean, his reading of Charlotte Bronte's and Wuthering Heights is just fantastic.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the essay that is, it's more or less complete, but I guess it's a work in progress insofar as it's not done until it makes it to the printing press. But it's called On War. And your approach was to basically take a synoptic approach from the beginning of Bataille's life and his writing, through the interwar period up until World War II. And it looks at, the essay itself looks at the relationship between Bataille and Ernst Junger, and the way that Junger's thoughts about war and inner experience impacted Bataille. But then later, the figure of Junger was abandoned by Bataille, and even some of these meditations on war either diminish or come to pass completely as we approach Bataille's final writing of The Accursed Share. So maybe you can kind of take us through the essay and what you're trying to do.
Yeah, so I kind of wanted to tackle a sort of image of Bataille rather than the scholarly reception of him, which is the kind of, when one thinks of Bataille, one might think necessarily of Nick Land's book, The Thirst for Annihilation, this thinker who is the thinker of, Hellraiser, who sort of really throws us into living experiences, and he does do this, but also thinks they're good. Bataille is kind of he talks a lot about war in his earlier days. The Sacred Conspiracy, the first paper of the Acéphalous journal, says what we are starting is a war. And he talks a lot about, in the notion of expenditure, he talks about class struggle in these very warlike terms. And it's easy to see Bataille as a thinker profoundly invested in kind of a usefulness to war, or at least an experience of war which actually has some quality that goes beyond the regular boredom and oppression of everyday capitalist experience. And one of the things I wanted to look at is, because Bataille is one of those thinkers that you would sometimes see placed alongside people like Ernst Junger and someone like Yukio Mishima. And I don't think he fits entirely with those kind of suicidal, in the case of Mishima, and sort of relatively pro-war, pro-martial images you might get with someone like Junger. But one of the things I tried to do in his essay was to give a history of Bataille's thought as it relates to war, and how it changed the book that eventually became The Accursed Share, Volume 1. Because before, we talked about this a few episodes ago, possibly even a year ago now. The first draft of The Accursed Share was called The Limit of the Useful, and it has a whole it has a whole section on war, and the section on war is just basically, here's what I learned from Ernst Junger on war. And what's interesting is, after the war, the limit of the useful is dropped as the war kicks off. It doesn't really come back at all. It's just parked. It's why it's published now as a separate book. The Accursed Share Volume 1 comes out, I think, about 10 years later, quite some time, a few years after the war. And the section on Junger is entirely absent. The focus on the experience of war is completely gone. And I think you can explain this both through Bataille's literature as well as his sort of more philosophical writing. So in Guilty and Inner Experience, he says that, look, the whole Acéphalous project, the project of making a vanguard communist religion to sort of fight fascism, they put that aside because they knew they wasn't going to be able to do anything like that ever, because the time frame was gone, because the war had already broken out. And then we have, for example, a book like Blue of Noon, which is written around 1936, 37. And in that book, a self-insert figure, Troppmann, who is a sort of self-hating necrophiliac, sort of goes around France and Germany and Spain. So Spain he goes to just before the onset, well, at the onset of the Spanish Civil War, and the book ends in Germany, where he's dropping sort of his object of romantic love, Dorothea, or Dirty, as Troppmann calls her, off in Germany. And it ends with this, him leaving her behind. She's wearing a red dress that is, quote, the red color of swastika flags. And as she leaves, he realizes that her sort of desire for death and excess will kill her. And he's surrounded by these Hitler Youth choirs and SS officers. And he says something along the lines of, I can't stop screaming. He says that he's realizing that, and we get the quote up. He says he realizes that what's coming is, quote, this rising tide of murder, far more incisive than life. I found myself confronting this catastrophe. I was filled with the black irony that accompanies the moments of seizure when no one can stop screaming. Bataille is basically sort of riddled with the horror of war and the portents of the coming war in the late 30s. And he didn't publish Blue of Noon until 1957. Because he said, look, and he says in the foreword to that book, he said, look, friends told me to publish this. I think everything was rendered insignificant by the war. And you can see there's a real strong break in a sort of Bataille we get that's very sort of full on, kind of accelerationist sort of sense, and the Bataille we get after the war. And I think what's most interesting is The Accursed Share is a book which, much like the work of Kant, aims at producing perpetual peace, or what Bataille calls dynamic peace. Because Bataille thinks that war is inevitable only in the sense that waste is inevitable. There's always going to be an excess in any productive process which is not going to be fed back into growth, and therefore is consigned to waste or exhaustion or loss. Now, Bataille thinks that war is only one mode of expenditure. You can do it from festivals, luxury, welfare redistribution. And he thinks, okay, look, he believes the Soviet defectors who speak to the US. He actually quotes one of them in The Accursed Share. He quotes Viktor Kravchenko, and he says, Kravchenko says, if you don't think the Soviets have nukes or they won't have them soon, you're engaging in disinformation. Not disinformation, but the equivalent thereof before that term was coined. And Bataille, in his very sort of Trotskyist history of the Soviet Union, and he does cite Trotsky and Isaac Deutscher quite a bit in his understanding of the Soviets. He thinks that ultimately both of these states, these powers, the US and the Soviet Union, are accumulating so much that they can only really tend towards the arms race, the inevitable proliferation of war. And Bataille's, he knows he can't really do anything about this, but he wants to offer an alternative. And the alternative is to model it on the Marshall Plan, which is when, after the war, Western Europe received $17 billion from the US government, seemingly free of charge. I mean, Bataille's not stupid here. He knows that the US is buying off Europe from communism. But he nonetheless thinks there's a model there where all of the excess of the hyperproduction of capitalism doesn't have to go to war. They can just give it away to raise the general standard of living. And one of the first things Bataille says is, in order to have a dynamic peace, we're going to have to, for example, he says the US should give as much money to India as possible without any sense of getting it back, without receipt. It's going to be how I phrase it is, it's rather than the arms race, it's the alms race, where each one is competing to sort of raise the global standard of living. The excess becomes a kind of social democracy for Bataille. I mean, there are limits to this. I know I've been ranting quite a bit. We could probably get into them later, but that's the general thesis there. That Bataille's work becomes all about fermenting a kind of class war to realizing that, having a kind of pessimism in the face of World War II that says instead we should just do a kind of global redistributive democracy in the face of what he thinks are the brute facts of how economics work. And he's offering this as kind of a global Marshall Plan to supplement or to replace the Cold War.
I should say we have about 20 plus people listening right now. This is a light Ask Me Anything, so go ahead and pop anything, any comments that you want, questions. We're talking about Acéphalous, which is a publication that Bataille's working on, that Adam and our friend Noah and I are working on, hopefully to be released next year. And we have a Kickstarter program that should be linked in the comments right now. You can go ahead and find that. And it's really just in our link tree on our main page. Oh, there it is. Yeah, there's, you can go ahead and just type that miles long URL into your Chrome and go ahead and support, or at least follow, the campaign before it kicks off, which will be on October 31st. So I'm just going to play devil's advocate here because I have my own answer to this question, but I'm curious what your answer is, Adam. So there is an attempt by those, either on the right or maybe those who want to claim that there is a sort of apolitical dimension to Bataille, or at least one that's counter to the sort of left-right paradigm as we understand it in the West, since the 20th century up until now. But, given that Bataille is a thinker of superabundance, very much in the same way that Nietzsche was, and there's, of course, multiple parallels between Nietzsche and Bataille, and there's one in particular on war, which is towards the end of Nietzsche's life, at least in his journals, it seemed that he had disavowed the prospect of the idea that culture could be driven forward by sending boys off to war. And, clearly within the scope of Bataille's works, it seems that war is this one event, almost an archetypal event of sorts, within human culture, human civilization, that he is trying to find any number of cultural means of fending off, whether that's by identifying, practices at the sort of local or global scale of expenditure, of sacrifice that would stave off the possibility of, and the worst of all possibilities, which would be global nuclear war. But given Bataille and, even Nietzsche, for example, and maybe we could even throw Junger in there too, who kind of offers a mea culpa about at least some of what transpired earlier in his career. But if we are looking at something like a cosmic violence, what we would ordinarily call the general economy, as being at odds with the restricted economy, which could be anything from feudalism to capitalism and so forth, it might seem that on the basis of what Bataille has written, that maybe war as an outgrowth of any sort of manifestation of civilization would be inevitable in some sense. Or why would we set up any kind of moral bulwark against the kind of ecstasy and excess that comes from the expenditure of war? I mean, just barring the whole nuclear war thing for a moment, like maybe, the plane of war is where a kind of vitality finds its ultimate exuberance and plays out in a way, and it separates grain from chaff and all that, and advances culture and so forth. Like, why don't we see that in Bataille? What are the sort of conceptual or philosophical ways in which Bataille deals with the problematic violence that's ordinarily associated with war?
In terms of Bataille's reflections on Junger, what's interesting about his reflection on Junger is that he does say there's a kind of paradox of Junger, which is there's something self-refuting about the fact he had to write it down, in the sense in which the experience is always going to be diminished in the same way that religious experience, in how we typically understand it, there's a kind of ineffability to it. Which is possibly another reason why he did put Junger down to that extent and picked up, more anthropological texts. I mean, Bataille is not the first thinker of that time to try to problematize the idea of global war and try to fend it off at any cost. And it's not a leftist thinker as the other person to stop this. It's Carl Schmitt. I mean, Carl Schmitt, the Nazi jurist, his book Nomos of the Earth and Theory of the Partisans is this project of trying to avoid global civil war. I mean, so the peace is not always a leftist front there, because ultimately a lot of leftists believes in class struggle and revolutionary wars. I mean, Bataille's sort of peacenikism, let's say, is a response to his sort of pessimism about the communist project, because he does genuinely believe that Stalin has this begrudging respect or recognition of Stalinism as an achievement of a kind of proletarian society. He's not that Trotskyist that he thinks it's, quote, and I'm using these quotes because I don't really like using this term, this is a term that Trotskyists use, a degenerated workers' state. That's the Trotskyist term. And so his response to it is when he wants to sort of try to revive, to bring out these claims about, isn't war glorious, isn't war lovely? I mean, typically, apart from Jung, most people would say the opposite. I mean, in the book Guilty, Bataille does say, here's a quote from Bataille here, for me, war was torment, falling off a rooftop, a volcano erupting. I despise the boorishness of people drawn to the combat aspect of war. It attracted me by provoking anguish. War professionals, so-called, are unfamiliar with these feelings. And by professionals, I'm not sure if you mean soldiers or war profiteers or generals and the like. And Bataille is attracted to that which scares him. That is kind of one of the lingering things. Bataille is not a thinker who leads into transgression because he thinks transgression is good for itself. I mean, he never even publishes most of his most transgressive works until either later or literally after his death. I mean, Story of the Eye was one of the main exceptions there, but even then it was a surrealist text, sort of an experimental one written under a pseudonym. I mean, we can't simply purely identify Bataille with, Lord Oche, as he calls himself as the Story of the Eye writer, in the same, in a very similar way that there's a sort of ironic distance between Kierkegaard, Johannes de Silencio, who wrote, I think that was Fear and Trembling, or Kierkegaard used a lot of synonyms and pseudonyms. Sorry, in relation to this sort of like horniness for war. I mean, it's just not in Bataille. I think his response to it is always going to be a kind of, this is horrific, even as it hasn't even started yet. But it's that horror, we spoke to Stuart Kendall about his essay, The Horror of Liberty. It's the horror that Bataille likes or thinks is interesting, not because it's horrific, because it shows there's a limit to our experiences and something that goes beyond discourse, something that goes beyond the sort of the structures that make us subjects in that way.
Yeah, and that's another thing that I think people often get wrong about Bataille when it comes to the conventional notion of the erotic as it runs up against his concept of eroticism, which is, I don't think Bataille simply appreciated horniness for horniness in itself. It's that he saw within the sexual act this running up against our own limits, and perhaps even an encounter with this perforated liminality that we could engage with the cosmic forces that little by little, or in big chunks from time to time, annihilate and slough off identities, states. I mean, for Bataille, ultimately, the sacrifice is something within which all distinctions must come to pass. And here we're talking subject and object, things perhaps even like gender and all sorts of identities that enter into the space where sacrifice is conducted. And this can be a real sacrifice. I mean, that certainly happens within war. What happens when a bomb goes off in a locality and just absolutely dismembers people? I mean, we have a literal commingling of parts and bodily fluids, but also there's a way in that we can read Bataille where this sacrifice happens symbolically, and it can happen through real acts, but this symbolic disintegration of the symbolic order, the sign, as it were, is a way that his ideas, I think, are utterly important to us, and hopefully something that we address within the book. I had another follow-up question on that, but it has actually slipped my mind. Adam, do you want to respond to that at all once I get my thread back here?
Sort of the collapsible things in this sort of melee of war. I mean, it's one that almost wishes this was still the case to some extent, insofar as wars are becoming more and more abstracted. I mean, we see this with essentially, we see. I mean, let's be honest. Let's think about that. Bataille is talking about a rising fascist force that is spreading death across the earth. And we have this is what the Israeli occupation forces are doing. And they are essentially trying to make the world adequate to their images of themselves and indeed their wars. I mean, this is why they only send troops in after a fuck ton of what my friend calls emotional support bombing. When you essentially flatten out the ground, smooth out the space, if they want to if they still read their Deleuze, I don't think they really do, and thank God for that. They want to smooth out the space, and they just completely destroy the very environments their actual soldiers train in. The generals stay behind, still wanking themselves off to the glory of war, as Junger would put it, but then just sending other fascists into the meat grinder because they simply there is no experience of war for them. It is basically just an abstract flattening, just a pure abstract flattening and in genocidal sort of rage. It is the I think it's a very similar thing that Bataille was looking at in Blue of Noon, apart from the fact that Bataille wasn't writing about it as it was happening. To extent, yes, Spanish Civil War, but nothing on the scale that we can see replicated in even smaller regions of the globe, as we're seeing in across Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine right now. I mean, Bataille's solution to this, from the standpoint of the Accursed Share Volume 1, would be just give people stuff back without expectation of anything receiving. It's giving people their stuff back, giving back their land. I mean, there's an interesting thing here. So when Bataille talks about the US giving a Marshall Plan to India, for example, what's interesting for me is that why isn't Bataille saying this about the British? I mean, not only hundreds of years of colonialism, but particularly around that time, the Bengal famine. Why is Bataille talking about reparations? Bataille's not talking about reparations because the logic of the movement of wealth is not one that's based on debt. It's based on expenditure. And rather, so I think Bataille basically thinks the US has the most geared up mechanism for spending, and therefore it does. It's been sort of the least ravaged by the war compared to the other European empires. I mean, he doesn't focus much on the French one, which is a little suspicious, I would say, or at least an omission. But yeah, Bataille's not working logic of reparation here. He's working logic of avoiding war at all costs. I mean, this is kind of the spectrum of the nuclear taboo here, which is that's the one taboo Bataille sort of acknowledges but doesn't want to be broken. And he does talk about war later on in his life. I mean, The Tears of Eros, one of his last books, but it's more through how it impacts painting. It's less in this sense of avoiding it. He's kind of calmed down in the sense of this fear of the Cold War by then, weirdly, because it was the 60s. I mean, he does talk a little bit in that book about his daughter who's been arrested for protesting against the French counterinsurgency in Algeria. So, who knows? There could be more to it there.
I caught my Ariadne's thread again, and I realized what it is that I wanted to ask you about. When we were pre-gaming this chat today, I had the random shower thought, or, just something I had thought of while on a walk earlier yesterday, was the emphasis on sacrifice in Bataille made me think of that the catch cry of many leftists, which is solidarity and not charity. And, I want to preface that all of my comments in advance by saying that what this statement typically refers to is we don't want to live in a world where, you have an economic axiom that gives to a very small percentage or a ruling class, for lack of a better term, the ability to appease the poor by, acts of charity and acts of giving from above after rampant accumulation and an appropriation of the surplus of labor and so forth. But I think maybe at a psychological or / ethical level, there's a way in which the concept of charity or the image of charity, I think, does capture this idea of a sacrificial distribution. I mean, at least in the case of Bataille, going back to the whole example of India, we live in a world where now we have utterly accumulated in the global north and robbed the global south of its resources. And as a sort of incipient gesture to any kind of solidarity, there would need to be a massive act of charity to take place as embedded within a broader sense of solidarity. But I'm curious if you have a way of responding to just the notion of charity itself, the notion of giving, the notion of a kind of overflow. And this is a theme that I've often connected to my reading of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. I think in the prologue, I think the ethic that Nietzsche is emphasizing is that the kind of community that he endeavors to create is one which internalizes this notion of sacrifice as a kind of ultimate ethic. But I was curious about your thoughts on that, especially in relation to war.
I mean, one of the things I mentioned towards the end of the essay is, if folks remember or know of the kitchen debates. So Khrushchev and Nixon would literally go into a model of a kitchen on US TV and debate sort of who could provide the better standard of living, who has the better tech between the USSR and the USA. And I think Bataille was really working on that model of competing. Ultimately, in the best scenario, both powers of the Cold War will be competing to raise the global standard of living. In doing so, he doesn't really have much of a theory of how capital accumulation actually works, because then it'd be like, well, yes, they can give their stuff away, but how are they accumulating in the first place? What if that's the problem? In terms of the question of charity, I mean, in the notion of expenditure, that essay that you can find in Visions of Excess, Bataille talks about wealth having a kind of obligation that comes to it. And this is particularly something that comes about. He thinks in Europe it reached its kind of heights at sort of Middle Ages Catholicism, and the obligation of the wealthy to give to the poor, or particularly to the church, for the sake of their souls. And this kind of completely, and he's following Weber here, completely flies out the window in Catholicism. And if anything, charity becomes, and here I'm also drawing on Friedrich Engels, a kind of way of buying off the poor for revolt, or at least getting them out of your sight. Right. I mean, charity necessarily doesn't have to be. I mean, charity is interesting. It doesn't have to be necessarily always a position of from above. I mean, is charity always a gift? If Bataille wants to think about charity, I mean, I don't think Bataille does talk about charity a lot. I think he talks more about the gift. I think the thing about charity for Bataille is more that it's a gift than it's charity. And the gift is problem, because this is getting this theme from Marcel Mauss, the anthropologist, who is the groundwork of the work of Claude Lévi-Strauss, and that is the groundwork of structuralism in anthropology. And then Derrida writes stuff about how the gift is kind of impossible because it's a free given, really given thing, but there's always like a paradoxical element of exchange there. I mean, it's this question which Bataille doesn't resolve, and in a way only sort of reaches any kind of standard position on a potential resolution, even as a paradox, in someone like Derrida, or moving on for people like Lévi-Strauss going forward, and then maybe someone like Jean-Luc Nancy, Maurice Blanchot, who of course the latter of whom latter two you've covered on Left Hand. A question of Bataille. I mean, solidarity is an interesting paradigm to use at this point in time. Now, what do I mean by that? I'm not going to say that solidarity is bad. No, what I mean is that it's very easy for solidarity to become detached from struggle, in which one can say sort of solidarity and go, sort of like, I'm with you, sort of, you're in my thoughts, we might, but there's sort of an active solidarity, and then there's sort of the more signaling of it, but doesn't necessarily mean that struggle is there. Can you be in solidarity with someone and not be in struggle with them? And this isn't necessarily because of a fault on the person doing the solidarity. Sometimes it might be you don't know how, or there's a strong repressive apparatus, or you're very far away. I mean, I wonder if solidarity is really a strong concept for Bataille. His theory of class war doesn't seem to have much room for it, other than the fact that the people who are doing class struggle are fighting in a way. They're condemning the fact that the society's condemned them to waste and to exhaustion and to death. And this is why I think, and this is why I'm also borrowing from Ariadne here, that something like Orlando Patterson's theory of social death when it comes to enslaved peoples very much fits into a lot of what Bataille can do for us here. Yeah, and I don't know if there's solidarity there so much as kind of the condemned condemning their own condemnation and sort of spending their lives fighting something that is going to exhaust their lives regardless. It reminds me of this phrase from Cedric Robertson's Black Marxism when he's talking about the Haitian insurrections before the revolution really sort of took over. And he says, even their dead were free.
Just thinking on the fly here too, I think the distinction between charity and gift is important in many ways. One, primarily, I think there's a kind of moralism, not necessarily a morality or an ethic, but a kind of moralism embedded within the concept of charity when it's elevated to the notion of the kind of giving that goes from top to bottom, and it's accentuated as such, and it has these political effects, like you said, just kind of deflating or enervating the kind of tension that would ordinarily bring about a class struggle. I mean, that's the point of some of this charity. Whereas the notion of a gift, I think, is more multifarious, and it can be more diffuse in its effects. So, for example, I remember once talking with somebody, maybe it was online, I can't even remember, but this conversation has deeply embedded itself within me, which is somebody who talked about, for example, a riot as being a kind of gift to oneself, or the community's gift to itself, where the sort of expression of a kind of exuberance is the release of a surplus of tensions across the social field that it is in no way charitable, right? But could certainly be construed as a gift. And I also think too, the notion of charity against the notion of sacrifice also shows charity to be more morally delimited. I would like to live in a world where there are forms of sacrifice of all kinds. I mean, we've all had that feeling of, I mean, come on, just like helping somebody out for like 4 hours and completely selflessly, not even thinking, in the moment of assisting somebody with a task, or if you've ever had to deal with somebody who's been bedridden, you kind of get lost in that act sometimes, to the point where you're not thinking in terms of the selfishness. There's a kind of an intensive relation between you and the person that you're sacrificing your time or energy to, and maybe in very sort of simplistic terms, you become one with that situation. And I don't know, that seems more akin to sacrifice than, let's say, charity, where charity wants that recognition. It operates in the register of being noticed as being the kind of giver. And then that also then gets folded back into the exchange economy. And so I think with Bataille, one of the things that I've always appreciated about his work is that we get to go back to this kind of thinking that breaks us out of the exchanges paradigm.
I mean, if you're listening, I mean, it seems like charity is the sadistic part and sacrifice is the masochistic part. There's something more of self-giving to masochism in the sense of making a contract and, for subjection, than there is something about charity. I mean, there's a kind of sadism to billionaires giving a bit of their portion away, which is usually for tax reasons and usually to give like members of their family big bonuses, and the sort of the subjection, the abjection, the destitution of all of everyone, and especially those hit most by sort of the capitalist economy. This is complete. This is fuel for charity. It's fuel for charity. As masochism is, if anything, asks only that one honours a contract that is given. I mean, the concept of charity here, but just going a bit forward towards the end of going back to war. I mean, I think one of the problems with Bataille's thesis, and there's many problems. One, that no one's going to listen to him to get to make him give all his money away, is that he has kind of, in his sort of relapsing into a kind of social democracy without class struggle, he's made it a charitable donation by these powers, rather than, what if the people who actually accumulated, who are part of the accumulation process, what if they stop it? I mean, this is it's a bog standard Marxist critique of Bataille, and it's one that I do hold to, which is Bataille is all about channeling flows of actually existing energy, actually existing bodies, actually existing wealth and goods. He is not talking about, and this is why I think his understanding is kind of deficient, of capitalism. He's not talking about commodities, and he's not talking about value. It's like, yeah, we can redistribute wealth, but the system isn't about producing wealth. It's about producing value, which can be totally detached from wealth. I mean, as Tony Negri and Felix Guattari said in their book Communists Like Us, which we did an episode on a couple of years back, who wants all this shit? like, if anything, sort of the things we sort of need and want, there are probably less of them, or at least less the ones we think we typically want or we do actually want under any sort of non-capitalist system. I mean, this is, if anything, war is kind of breaks out sort of to re-engage us in the process of consumption in a way. I mean, what is the genocidal wars of the IDF other than a way of keeping expanding upon seizures of land in the way to, one, to embolden the wealth of land, but also as well to produce value for arms companies. Most of what whose wealth is in Lockheed Martin. It's mostly just producing value all the time. Yes, people can spend some of that value in the form, in the mediation of money, but even then, it's goes to this point that Herbert Marcuse talks about later, which is the irrationality of capitalist reason. It's rational for capital to act in this way that puts the entirety of the world in danger.
Well, we're coming up on the hour here, but I would be
let's open it up.
Yeah, if anybody has any questions, like ask me anything type questions about Bataille in particular, questions about our project, please feel free to ask at this time. Either Adam or I can certainly answer them for you. And as you're preparing those questions, I would just say, in the meantime, first of all, people in the chat, there's just a few comments that I'd like to highlight, and I'll just put it on the screen. IMG MVR, I think that's Image Mover. Image Mover Productions. Just wanted to say I discovered your show a few weeks ago, and it's given life to my long, sad commute to work. Never knew much of Bataille until you guys. Cheers. Keep up the good work. And nothing like forming a new parasocial relationship, like I got to say, Image Mover, no. But we're glad to be in your ear. And, as Adam and I have said in the past, this podcast has been a way for us to learn these ideas ourselves. We hit the books. And, we come back a week or two after making a decision about a particular episode, and we come on here, and sometimes we're talking about them for the first time. So it's really important for us to make that connection with somebody like you right now. It really confirms for us that, hey, what we're doing is worthwhile. And also we have Dr. Waterloo who says, hey, good humans, congrats, Acid Horizon, for keeping the content going for so long now. Thanks. Yet the content faucet is not being turned off, at least not today. And so, yeah, Dr. W, thank you for supporting. We do see you on Twitter from time to time. And yeah, it's just like I said, this is a good time for us. And I was going to say, I would be remiss not to say that there is something, Adam, slightly subversive about us coming on the live stream to talk about sacrifice and charity. And also to promote our new book, Acéphalous, and the tarot deck that goes with it. But we just want to say, look, Adam and I and Will, we're not here to make $1 million. And, I'm doing this.
It's good, because we definitely won't.
We're not making $1 million doing this. But it's at the point where I actually had to change my life entirely in order to keep Acid Horizon going. And so if you're listening as a patron of Acid Horizon or LEPHT Hand, it's because you people are doing this. We don't use advertisers on our channel. I mean, of course, on YouTube, we do get some advertising revenue there, but we try to keep our audio feed clean of that stuff. You're never going to hear me pimp myself out for Harry's Razors or whatever the hell it is they have on most of those podcasts. And so those who are supporting us at the $1 level, the $5 level, the $20 level, just want to say thank you to those people right now. And I think going forward, I mean, this is at least true for me, probably true for Adam. If this Kickstarter is a success, this is a model for us to, every year, every 2 years, produce a book. And then we wouldn't be beholden to certain entities that tend to take more profit than that I think they're entitled to. And it allows us to just give back more to our community too. The reason that I show up to do this podcast is the podcast itself. It is ends and means in one. And then also to spread the good word and to connect with comrades and that sort of thing. So I just want to say thank you to everyone for that. Adam, is there anything that you want to add?
No, I mean, all that and more. I mean, it is weird sometimes when I feel like we've just been doing this for almost 5 years. Weird. That is weird. That is fucking weird. I do occasionally bump into people at live events if I do any, we've been listening to undergrads, when I'm like, well, no, hold on, no, that's just that's not true. That can't be true. But no, it is somewhat surreal. I mean, in terms of, in this Bataille book, it is us trying to once again go sort of fully independent relative to, because at the end of the day, the publishing industry, it is kind of structured like a VC firm to the extent, there is capital that throws money at various imprints and books, and then to try and make a sort of big one go off. And it can be, it's very much tied to a patronage model. And I do think it's better to diffuse patronage from one person to a plurality of people on that kind of gift economy basis. I mean, we don't have, we never really did the standard model of a lot of podcasts, which isn't a bad model. We're not shitting on this model, which is, you do one on, one off, one free, one paid, and then you have like different series, different tiers. That's perfectly fine. I sub to plenty of them. It's just I don't know. We just never started off doing that model because we wanted to sort of give away our degrees for free to some extent. Oh, sorry, I've just realized.
That question just popped up. Did you want to finish your thought, or should we throw the question out here? The question is from...
I think my thought's just been thrown out now.
Okay. All right. Well, it's Mandy.
How many penises does Cerberus have? 1 or 3? All right, let's give a Bataille an answer here. I mean, so for Bataille, given the sort of the... I mean, Bataille's a picture of headlessness, but there's always a lot of cock involved, isn't there? See, it's okay. Let's try. I don't know, but try a Hegelian answer instead. That might be a bit easier. The penis is the unity of the object of waste and generation. That's a quote from the Phenomenology of Spirit. Does Cerberus have 1 or 3? I mean, does Cerberus need 3? Do beings of the underworld need genitals in the same way? This is the question. Is the underworld space of waste? I mean, this might be closer to a James Hillman question. I don't know.
Well, there's definitely a Hillman-Bataille overlap here in that we have, guarding the gate of the underworld, 3 heads. So in that sense, I mean, Hercules is the one who... Well, there's actually multiple versions of the Hercules story. There are stories in which he kills the Cerberus. There's one where I think he just knocks him out. Is there one where he like piggybacks him back up to the daylight world? I can't remember.
Puts him to sleep or something. Not in the sense of killing him, but soothes the savage beast. I mean, also just saying it straight up. You thought we wasn't going to answer that question? No. Or maybe that's part of the dance of let's get these stupid philosophers to answer any question with way more confidence than they necessarily are allowed to have.
Now the chat is going off, and this is how the live stream economy works: is you address one of those questions, and it just multiplies that energy. And I think that
you don't have any questions that aren't about penises. That's fine if there's not. If there's only questions about penises. I mean, we're not a Lacanian podcast. I should stress that. But
wait, hold on a second. There's something that I'm learning here. It's a trick question. Cerberus is, and I'm going to butcher the name, Hakataz. Cerberus is a lady doggo. All right. Well, in any event, are we saying that Cerberus does not have a penis? Okay. Well, in any event, look, Cerberus could have penis, could not. Are we leaving this in the actual audio?
Are we leaving? I don't know. I don't think we should. I think this might have to be the exclusive for the heads that come to the live events. The live stream. Does two philosophers, possibly 1 or several penises. Deleuze and Guattari. Well, in any event, it is certainly how many angels can you fit on the head of a pin question for our time. Yeah. So. We are exactly at 1 hour and 11 seconds as I'm reading this. But if you're listening now, this will be just about the end of the podcast. Wherever I release this, which I think I'm going to release it on Left Hand, which is my solo channel, just where I'm doing like mostly essays in a way to sort of curate a certain kind of work in a single space. And if you're listening to this on Acid Horizon or watching the live stream on our YouTube channel, for example, just go ahead and sub that. But more importantly, follow the project, which is Acéphalous, the erotic tarot of Georges Bataille. And then on October 30th, we have an official launch for that campaign. And it's at that time where people can start contributing. They can either buy the tarot deck, they can buy the book and the deck. I think we're going to make it so that people can just buy the book too, if they don't want the tarot deck, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, prints of the cards.
Prints of the cards.
If you want to be a card, there are opportunities for that, subject to, of course, certain stratifications to make sure that people are actually getting getting one, value for money, and two, we actually know, security of data and information there, because that's very important these days. There'll be stretch goals, so the more we get, the more we can offer. And we've already started getting quotes for decks and books. It's going to look fantastic. I mean, the design Craig has done for the main sort of back of the cards it reminds me of like a Sith, like from Star Wars, sort of prayer book. And Bataille does talk about prayer books a lot. I mean, he says that the Marquis de Sade's 120 Days of Sodom is like a prayer book. He doesn't mean that in a good way. He agrees with Klosowski, who, according to Bataille, is a Christian. I don't know. Essentially, de Sade's most violent works are kind of boring because they have this prayer-like structure of, and lo, did the aristocrat do this to X amount of people. I'm not going to recount what de Sade does in this. I mean, there is a new edition, actually, of 120 Days of Sodom that has Bataille's foreword to it, because Bataille did do a foreword, and it's quite brief. I mean, if you ever read 120 Days of Sodom, it is actually quite a boring book. A lot of the Sodom is quite boring. I mean, but apart from philosophy in the bedroom, actually, I think that's actually quite an interesting one. Or his philosophical dialogues like that, and a dialogue between a priest and a dying man. I mean, there were some de Sade's writings, like the novel Adelaide of Brunswick, which are just not transgressive at all. And I think, again, Bataille is someone who fits into the mythology about de Sade's writings. But actually, one of the essays in the book is going to be about Bataille's relationship to de Sade as one of essentially a kind of boredom.
I wonder if we should open the book with like an Apostles' Creed type prayer, but done in the Bataille fashion.
I mean, he did write the method of meditation and similar things for Acéphalous. It wouldn't be hard, or even if there was something that a text of theirs that was quite short and wasn't translated, and if we did get Stuart on board, maybe he would be interested in translating a little bit of that. But then that would require possibly permissions from estates, and even some of the older French literary estates of these sort of era philosophers can be quite strict on these kind of things. Yeah. Probably less so with Stuart, but I mean, for example, Alexandre Kojève, the guy who taught Bataille and Lacan and Sartre and Quinault and all that, Hegel. His niece is very strict with who gets to translate certain books. I mean, I know people that translated his book on Kant, and it wasn't the translation that got published quite recently.
Right on. Well, I think that's about it for us for today. I think we should do more Friday live streams. We've had a fair number of people come through for this, so that's nice. And like I said, this will be released as an audio in an audio form in case you want to listen to it again on Left Hand. And then this particular video will probably just remain on the Acid Horizon account with all the links below. Subscribe to everything. And I just want to say thanks to my comrade Adam for coming on the show as my guest on Acid Horizon, but will be posted on Left Hand, whatever the heck this is. But thanks to everybody who asked questions and participated in the chat as well. Hopefully we'll do something like this again. Yeah, in the near future. And look forward to something very cool coming on the Acid Horizon channel in about 2 weeks. So fun stuff ahead. Take care, everyone.
Yeah. Catch you later.